Hi folks, this is Dr. Rob Sivers. I am the Carb Addiction Doc, and we've been doing a series on inflammation in the gut. And in the last one, we talked about SIRS, chronic inflammatory response syndrome. And at the tail end of that, I talked a little bit about SIBO, which is SIBO, which is the small intestine bacterial overgrowth. And I want to do a little bit of a deeper dive into SIBO and kind of give you maybe an alternate thought process that mechanically and physiologically, unless you have a stricture or an obstruction or a diverted segment of the small intestine, it is impossible to get small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Or, of course, if you have an acute infection like an E. coli infection, a Shigella, Salmonella infection, H. pylori, those should all be checked for. Those are easy to check for to make sure there's no parasites in the gut. But assuming that all of those are negative, a large sector of our population latches onto this bacterial overgrowth, which is, quite frankly, the least important thing to look at, the least important and the least likely issue. And yet we put that up front, we ignore all the other noise, which I'm going to discuss in detail right now, and we throw a whole bunch of antibiotics and elemental diets and cleanses and all this crap that they sell you. If there is a sales pitch, if you are spending money on the treatment of SIBO, you're a victim. Let me say that again. If you are spending money consulting on, getting testing for, paying out of pocket for testing, especially bizarre tests, and if you are spending money on therapy or specific elemental diets, you are a victim of somebody selling you something you are not going to get long-term healthy. You may see transient improvements because there's always a kumbaya honeymoon period. But you are losing money, you're wasting your time, which is fine, it's your money. But what's more important, you're not getting the help that you need. So let's break this down. What really is happening in the gut? The first thing to understand, and the human physiology and human anatomy is beautiful, okay? The base of the brain, parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, is the oldest of the human nervous systems, one of the oldest. And that nervous system, that limbic nervous system, controls the entire intestine. It actually controls the heart, it controls the lungs, it controls the esophagus, and it controls the entire gut. And that is the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. And it's influenced by functions from the base of the brain and signals that go back, chemical signals and nerve signals that go back. So the brain and the gut are continuously talking to each other, both through nerves as well as through chemicals. And a chemical that transitions, that sends a message elsewhere, to put it in a lay term, is called a hormone. So hormones get produced and released in a certain place, go somewhere else and have an effect. They talk. Now, that's not physiological, but they talk, they send messages, and they interact with each other, and it's usually homeostatic. When one goes up, the other goes down, and they have an effect on each other. As well as the nerves. There's a signal that goes down, and then a signal goes back up, motor and sensory nerves. And the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic, sympathetic system, doesn't quite act that way, but it's much more integrated between hormones and nerves. So the brain integrally controls the gut. And if you're stressed out, if you've got adrenaline override, adrenaline hormones coming from the gut, not cortisol, but adrenaline, goes up to the brain. It activates certain sympathetic nervous systems that then regulate the gut. Very tightly connected. So the first thing that we want to look at is, do we have a signaling pathway problem, particularly in one nerve, which runs from the brain, controls the heart, controls the esophagus, controls the upper gut, controls the entire gut, called the vagus nerve. And I would urge you to go to Google. Yes, if you're not a doctor, I'm giving you permission to go to Google, even though your doctor says you are not Dr. Google. I love Google as a doctor, and so should you. It's information. Go to Google, look up the vagus nerve, and you'll see all the things that it does, all the things it regulates. Regulates heart rate. It's the nerve that in movies, we push on over here to get you to faint, okay? It doesn't really work that way, but that's the vagus nerve. And when the vagus nerve gets triggered appropriately or inappropriately, it has certain effects. So for some people with a hiatal hernia, especially if you've had a hiatal hernia repaired or if you've had a lap band or something like that, as you eat, when that food goes down the esophagus contracts, triggered by the vagus nerve. It's got natural contraction about every 8 to 12 seconds. It's sending a wave of contraction that runs the entire length of the gut. That is a natural wave of contraction that goes through the gut and propels food forward. Now, it can be activated or dumbed down a little bit, but that is a natural propulsion, which avoids stasis. It means that the gut is just not going to hang out there and be quiescent. There's certain disease conditions where that occurs, but not in SIBO. Anyway, that's vagus nerve. But if you, at the lower part of the esophagus, where the esophagus joins the stomach, if you get food trapped there, the vagus nerves come down and they kind of twist around, okay, from being anterior and posterior to being on the sides as they enter the stomach. They rotate. And if you get food stuck there, you can trigger the vagus nerve and you can have certain horrible symptoms, but also you can have increased waves going down the gut. If you have acid reflux, reflux goes from, it's acid from the stomach, or it could be bile reflux, which is alkaline coming from the upper intestine through the stomach up into the esophagus. That also triggers the vagus nerve and causes vagus nerve irritability, which can increase the waves, decrease the waves, alter that. So one of the commonest problems we see with the gut is neuropathology, abnormal nerves. Now, lower in the gut, we've got certain diseases that you can be born with. Hirschsprung's disease, as a pediatric surgeon, we deal with that quite a bit, where the nerves didn't grow all the way down, or you've got abnormal Meyer and Auerbach plexuses in the colon. So you can have abnormal nerves that affect your gut. Absolutely, and those should be looked for. If you've got chronic constipation, especially as a baby, and you've always had constipation, we biopsy the gut and look at those nerves under the microscope. So the neuropathology is crucial to the function of the gut. And because that sympathetic parasympathetic nervous system is not just the nerves, but it's regulated, more so than probably any other nervous system, regulated by hormonal feedback. We've got to look at some of those hormones, the adrenaline system, the noradrenaline system, the dopamine system, the cortisol system that light the fire, that put the fire out. All of those systems interact with the nerves, and it's important to look at those. Don't look at cortisol, because cortisol is a response problem and cannot adequately be measured in the blood. People make a lot of noise about cortisol. When they do, they probably don't know much about what they're talking about. And that comes from a friend of mine, David Diamond, who works in this space and works specifically with adrenaline and not with cortisol. So measuring those levels is a waste of your time and money, and focusing on cortisol as a problem is also a waste of time of your money. It's a euphemism. I recently had the privilege and honor of being invited out to California to shoot a new movie. I can't talk a lot about this, but it's going to be a really, really cool movie in our space. And all the big names were there and little old me. But it was very cool to be part of this high-end production that's being done by the producers of Shark Tank. It is going to be a phenomenal video in our space. And one of the sharks is the backer of this. And along those lines, they have a huge house in the hills of Los Angeles that they've bought, and that was the shooting venue. And it was so cool to see these teams construct. But I was living upstairs, and I was supposed to start my shoot at around 2 o'clock. And I was ready to go. Now it's California time, so it's a little later than East Coast time. Ready to go. And then the producer comes up to me and he says, "Dude, we've overshot with everybody else. We're delayed. Can you hang on?" And I said, "Sure, I can hang on." And 1 hour led to a second hour, and I watched these great people giving their talks. But man, I was dragging. And I went down to the fridge downstairs in the kitchen. And what did I find? In the fridge, I found some ketone IQ. And so I said, okay, I'm dragging here. I've got to be on for my game. And I swigged down a ketone IQ. Man, did that give me a boost. I was able to go those 3 hours where there was delays and everything else. I eventually started my shoot around 5 o'clock, and I just blew it out the water as far as I'm concerned. Really, really enjoyed it. It's going to be a great movie coming out probably around April, May next year. Look for it. I can't tell you more about it. But this ketone IQ, folks, gave me the boost I needed to deal with the disruption of my timing. You know, you get your game face on. It's like having a rain delay while you're playing golf. Hit a ketone IQ and your game will be on. Mine certainly was. So the neuropathology, which is hormonally and nerve regulated, that connection between the brain and the gut, very, very important. Okay. And understanding GI signaling, we're just starting to scratch the surface of this. So one of the hormones that we've always known was there, or for a long time I've known it was there when I was in medical school, but we didn't pay attention to it because we didn't know what it does, was a group of hormones called the incretins. And one of the most common incretins is GLP-1. Everybody knows GLP-1 because we've suddenly, over the last 2 or 3 decades, done massive work on GLP-1s and discovered what an important hormone this is. Produced in the upper gut, produced in the lower gut, and the effect on insulin, the effect on other hormones is massive. And GLP-1 is triggered, for example, by carbohydrates, which delays the stomach emptying. It blocks the nerves that cause the stomach to empty. You get gas bloat, you get gastroparesis or partial paralysis of the stomach. You can get irritable bowel syndrome by activation of those nerves. Not through the bacteria. They may have a tiny they may, M-A-Y, may have a tiny fraction of a role to play. But the reality is, even though billions of dollars have been spent on this, we have yet to identify, and I know people are going to rail at me and argue with me about this, we have yet to identify an absolute role of interaction between the gut bacteria, the brain, and we assume there's a role there. But when you talk to the people that work in the space, they desperately believe that there is a problem, but they haven't been able to identify it or fix it. So I was at a conference, the Swiss Re conference in Zurich, Switzerland last year. I was speaking there, and there was one of the world's experts on pre and probiotics. And they gave this wonderful lecture about, we've done this study and we've done this study. And somebody at the end of the talk stood up and said, do they work? And the guy said, it was a beautiful answer. He said, you know what, the reality is we think they might, but we have no proof that they do. This is from one of the world's experts in pre and probiotics. We hope they might. We think they might. We haven't discovered yet how. But to answer your question, I have no proof that they do. How much money, how much billions of dollars are you spending on prebiotics and probiotics to help your gut? Look at the advertising, look at the marketing. And yet, in an honest moment, the world's expert said, we have no proof. We have no proof. And I would tell you, from my perspective, as being more on the carnivore side, based on our gut physiology, those probiotics and prebiotics all align with a plant-based therapy, not an enzymatic therapy, a fermentational therapy, not an enzymatic therapy. So when we look at the gut biome, the ideal biome is more aligned with enzymatic digestion rather than fermentation. So if you're going to do anything with your gut biome, it's not to sterilize it, it's not to get rid of it, but it's to slowly transition the bugs that normally live in your gut toward those that are supportive of enzymatic digestion, animal products, meat, dairy, animal products, rather than plants. But that's the best you can do with your biome. And we've seen that with tremendous results, most recently published by Nick Norwitz in a small series, but also earlier on out of Australia, the resolution or the remission of Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis on a pure carnivore diet when that gut biome changes, and the anti-inflammatory nature of a more carnivore diet. Now, let's shift to something else that might be causing you a lot of problems. A bug called H. pylori in the stomach. H. pylori is a pathogen that lives on mucus in the stomach. I routinely test for H. pylori whenever I meet a person for the first time because we see positive rates, depending on the population, 30 to 40% of the time, very easily treated, and it's a very noxious bug. Creates GI irritability, can create bleeding, is in part of the upper GI cancers, the esophagogastric cancers, the metaplasia that occurs in Barrett's esophagitis, promoted very heavily reflux by H. pylori. So we should test for that. But that's a particular bug, one of the few bugs that actually lives in the stomach. And remember, the stomach acid is there to sterilize gut. So if you're on a proton pump inhibitor, if you're on an antacid medication because of reflux, and maybe you say, oh, my PPI helps, I have a hiatal hernia. Well, many people have hiatal hernias. A lot of them don't have reflux. Why? Because it's triggered by GLP-1. GLP-1 triggers reflux, triggers the gas bloat. What triggers GLP-1? Carbohydrates. So if you're on a low carbohydrate carnivore-based diet, your reflux usually gets better very, very quickly. And if it doesn't, as a surgeon, we look, could there be another cause for this? But that's not SIBO, folks. That's GLP-1 and a GI trigger. And there are other hormones, other incretins and somatomedins that come into that. Bile flow is another one. People say, oh, I've got to do a bile cleanse. No, you don't. Bile comes from the liver into the gut. The gallbladder just stores the bile to give you a bolus when you eat fat. And yes, there are many, many, many conditions that negatively affect the gallbladder that cause problems, from gallstones to gallbladder dysfunction. Absolutely, we've got to look at those. But that's not SIBO. That's not SIBO. And we've got to have an index of suspicion. We can do HIDA scans, we can do ultrasounds. We can look at gallbladder function. And that's a piece of it, but it's not SIBO. Then the big, big fallacy over the last 50 years, when we blamed fat, when the tobacco companies blamed fat, and we became lipophobic as a society in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, when we removed fat from our diet, we struggled to poop properly. And what did we do? We said, okay, fiber. We have just become cows, we've just become gorillas, we've just become herbivores, vegetarian, because a vegetarian diet is so much better. Fiber, soluble and insoluble fiber. And that is a major problem with irritable bowel, with colonic integrity breakdown, diverticulitis, irritable bowel syndrome, all the way through to Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, colon cancer going through the roof, primarily because of a combination of increased fiber in the gut together with unprocessed carbohydrates. Sugar and fiber is just an insoluble form of sugar. All fiber is carbohydrate. Think that one through. All cellulose is carbohydrate. Human beings have lost the capacity to process that. Cows can still do that. Gorillas can still do that. We don't. So the ruminant animals and those with large colons, they can do that. We've lost that capacity. So one of the biggest things to blame is fiber in your diet, and you do not need fiber in your diet. No mammal exists without because of fiber. No fiber in breast milk. Now, the ruminant animals use fiber to extract nutrition. We are not ruminant. We're monogastric. We've got a single stomach and a very small colon relative to other animals. We've got a very long small intestine, which is for enzymatic digestion, and it's moving all the time. SIBO doesn't exist. And if they're treating you for SIBO, they're not looking in the right place for the problem, and they're underdiagnosing you and selling you a bunch of product, selling you a bunch of tests that is not going to fix the problem. All these elemental diet, gut cleansers, colonics, all these probiotics, prebiotics. You're making money for somebody, but you're not solving yourself. Let's talk about it. If you're interested to hear our opinion, to get some of our testing done, if you're up to it, if you're willing to roll up your sleeves and do the hard work to change the lifestyle that is causing these problems, give us a shout, 561-517-0642. If you want some magical potion, powder, or medication to help you without changing your way of life, without addressing the root cause of the problem, don't bother. Don't bother. It's not going to work. Keep taking your powders and potions. But if you want to do the hard work of change to be better, if you want to climb the mountain to get to a better side on the other side, give us a shout. And if this video helps you to realign your thinking, to stop spending money, to stop going down rabbit holes that are inhuman. In other words, when I say inhuman, that do not support normal human physiology, but they got some mystical tail, and you'll always test positive with their testing. Think that one through. You'll always test positive. I am the Carb Addiction Doc. If you like what we do and you're interested, set up a consult or throw us a buck. And if you hate what I've just said, leave some comments. You can make them personal. You can tell me that, I'm a fat, ugly guy that is a waste of air. It's fine. But think about how that reflects on you. At the same time, if you want to give me your own personal story, which might be different from what I've just talked about, if you've bought the message from your SIBO treating doctor, if you're magically better, that's fine. Tell us your story. But this is what I see in my practice every day. And my thoughts and my discussion with you today is formulated based on what I've seen come through the door of my practice over the last 23, 24 years. These are my reflections from a very busy clinical practice. And if anybody is giving you advice about your gut based on an N of 1, their own experience, without ever seeing patients themselves, maybe that's a little bit of somebody telling you how to play tennis if they don't know how to play the game. Think that one through. Okay, I play the game every day. I suck at it, but I play the game every day.